Good evening, Moore, and welcome. Tonight we're going to be venturing into the depths of the woods because there are cabins here waiting for our arrival. I hope you're ready because it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Happened years ago when I was growing up in a tiny French village in mid-northern France, an area known for its vast forests. My little village was nestled in the middle of this forest, surrounded by trees on all sides. Most of the village's secluded population was elderly. The forest was so large that if you walked in one direction, it could take hours or even days to find any other proper civilization, aside from the occasional lone road. Now, don't get me wrong, the forest was lovely, and I have many cherished memories there. However, it was also rather secluded, and I can only imagine what mysterious things happened under the cover of dense twigs, branches, and leaves. Every day, my mom would drive my sister and me to school in the next town over. But on this particular morning, we had to stop the car just seconds after driving off. In the middle of this narrow and seldom used road stood an elderly woman in a nightgown, splattered with mud and bruises, seemingly exhausted beyond her wits. She was barefoot, her feet blackened by mud and caked with blood. She didn't flinch as the car approached her, nor did she show any signs of relief as my mom stepped out to greet her. She was terribly confused and didn't seem entirely sure what to say or how to begin. For a moment, she just babbled incomprehensibly. But within a few seconds, a somewhat coherent sentence started to form. She kept repeating that she had run all night. It was roughly 7:30 in the morning in early spring, so the sun had just begun to rise. She said she'd run through the forest, not knowing where to go, trying to escape something. As she caught her breath and gathered her thoughts, it became clear she had been trying to collect her memories. Someone, she said, had kept her locked up in a cellar. She didn't know where, how long, or who it was. She just knew they had locked her up in a damp and muddy place. She didn't remember how she got out, only that it was in the dead of the forest in the dead of night, and she ran as fast as her frail body would allow. At this point, it seemed she had nothing more to say. Her nighttime escape had culminated in us meeting her. I don't remember exactly what she and my mom discussed next, but it resulted in my mother calling the old lady's son, who lived on the other side of the village. A few minutes later, he arrived and told us we should leave. A few days later, I asked my mom if she knew what became of the old lady after we left her. Apparently, a few men had broken into her house that night, beaten her up, ransacked her home, and stolen some of her most expensive possessions. She had fled into the forest, which was only a few meters away from her house. If that isn't creepy enough, a few extra details stick out in my mind. First, when we found her in the middle of that narrow road, she was standing right next to her house. Perhaps the burglars were still in her home as we spoke to her. Her sense of time did seem distorted. Secondly, no mention of the supposed cellar where she was allegedly kept. Was it a figment of her panic and delusion, or had she really been locked up somewhere in the forest, only for no one to believe her? It seems unlikely, but you do occasionally stumble upon old and grotty stone huts and ruins in the forest. Perhaps one of them held a few gruesome tales to share. Unfortunately, we never spoke to that family again, so we never found out what really happened that night. I believe the elderly lady has now passed on, and we will never fully know the truth about that cellar. Nonetheless, whenever I return home and drive past that house on the narrow street, I can't help but remember the frail lady standing alone in her muddy nightgown. I used to live in a fairly busy condo complex, and the backyard of my condo extended about 10 feet before leading to a large wooded hill. In our area, we get a lot of snow, so the trees are typically hardy pines or oaks that can withstand both excess moisture and dry spells. With that context, let me share a strange experience. A few years ago, in late spring, I decided to explore the woods as I often did. The base of the hill was a bit muddy, and the trees had healthy, green leaves with no signs of pests or disease. It was clear that it had rained a couple of nights before. A few nights later, I woke to the terrifying sound of loud cracking and snapping coming from the woods. The next day, when I went outside, I was baffled to find that all the previously healthy trees were now dried out, and many were snapped halfway up their trunks. These were sturdy trees, and there were no signs of parasites or disease. I'm at a loss as to how these otherwise healthy trees could have been so abruptly torn in half and dried out in just a few days. Any theories or explanations would be greatly appreciated. A few years ago, my girlfriend and I decided to go camping in the nearby woods. These woods are quite expansive, and we had made it a habit to explore them every weekend for exercise. On this particular occasion, we decided to stay out a bit later than usual. We packed our gear in the morning and took a hike to a remote creek deep in the woods. Since we were the only ones around, we set up our tent and settled in for the evening. We had a portable power bank with us, and luckily, there was still cell service, so I spent some time scrolling through social media. It was getting late, around 10 p.m., the sun had set, and we were in our sleeping bags. My girlfriend fell asleep quickly, but I found the floor uncomfortable and struggled to get comfortable. After a while, feeling hot and frustrated, I decided to step outside to cool off. That's when I heard something unsettling, the sound of children laughing in the distance. I looked around but saw nothing, just pitch-black darkness. I strained my eyes, hoping to spot any distant lights that might explain the sound, but there was nothing. My anxiety grew, and I decided to investigate the source of the laughter. It felt unsafe for children to be playing in the woods at night. As I ventured towards the sound, it seemed to move further away, no matter how close I got. Eventually, the laughter stopped altogether, and I was suddenly aware of a deep, dark hole that I had almost walked into, a sort of ditch where no trees grew. It seemed like an old riverbed or something similar. I couldn't shake the feeling that the voices had led me to this dangerous spot, trying to lure me in. I made my way back to the tent, unable to sleep a wink. In the morning, I convinced my girlfriend to pack up and go home. I didn't explain why, but she could see the fear in my eyes. Some things are best left unsaid. When I was young, my parents always warned me not to venture into the woods behind our house. They said it was dangerous, with wild animals that could hurt me, and instructed me to stay within the garden's fenced area. For the most part, I followed their rules. But one day, curiosity got the better of me. I remember my father was busy cooking in the kitchen, and my mother was occupied with something upstairs. I don't recall exactly what. Unable to resist, I sneaked through the fence to take a quick peek into the woods. From my bedroom, I could see quite far into the forest, but there were parts one had never explored before. As I ventured further, my curiosity grew. I noticed something shiny on the ground ahead of me. It was a coin, a dime, I think, and as a 7-year-old, I was thrilled to find such a treasure. I thought there might be more scattered around, so I kept searching. That's when things went wrong. While I was focused on finding more coins, I didn't see a tree root protruding from the ground. I tripped, fell into a deep ditch, about 5 feet down, and got tangled in leaves and rocks. My arm was in excruciating pain, and I started to scream. I tried to move, but the pain was unbearable. Eventually, I managed to get to my feet, but with one arm in such pain, I couldn't figure out how to climb out. I screamed for what felt like hours until, just before dark, I heard my parents calling my name. I shouted back, and instead of scolding me for disobeying them, they helped me out of the ditch. My dad had to jump in and lift me out, then rushed me to the nearest hospital. The doctors found that I had fractured my arm in several places, injured my back significantly, though I hadn't noticed, and had various cuts and bruises. The doctors said we were very fortunate they found me when they did, as staying in that ditch overnight could have worsened my condition. I realized then that exploring the woods wasn't such a good idea. I didn't return to those woods until I was about 15, and even then, I never ventured as far as I did that first time. Please keep a close eye on your kids. My life could have turned out very differently if my parents hadn't found me. I live in Victoria, Australia, where snow is a rare sight unless you venture into the colder mountain regions. Growing up, my mom and I would visit my papa in Glenorchy at least once a year. During these trips, he would take us to a nearby mountain where we could enjoy the limited snow available. Though it was never much, we always cherished these moments. I vividly remember the nausea from the winding roads and the fear of our cars skirting off the narrow path and tumbling down the cliff. Good times indeed. On one such trip, my mom and I went for a small hike through a lush forest in the mountains. I was around 8 to 11 years old at the time, and while there wasn't much snow, just some patches, it was still beautiful, and we were alone. I don't remember why it was just the two of us. Perhaps my mom needed a break from Papa, who had a short-term camper at the time. As we stood there, a sudden and overwhelming sense of dread washed over us. It felt as though something was terribly wrong, and we both had an intense feeling that we should leave immediately. Despite it being broad daylight, and despite my extensive experience in such environments from being in Scouts, the feeling of being watched and judged was almost paralyzing. My heart raced, and I trembled as we hurried back to Papa's car. There were no signs of danger, no snapping twigs, ominous figures, or growls, just an unshakable feeling of terror. My mom later shared that she envisioned a large creature crawling up the mountain to get us. She described feeling as if each gust of wind brought the creature closer, with an urgent voice in her head telling her to leave. Fortunately, we made it back to the car safely and continued our trip. For years, I thought I was the only one who remembered this eerie experience and assumed it was all in my head. But a couple of years ago, my mom brought it up, confirming that it really happened. This discovery thrilled me, as I've always craved paranormal and unexplained experiences, yet I've had little luck finding them. Perhaps my skepticism has prevented me from acknowledging that the world is more supernatural than we often perceive. About a month ago, I was walking my boyfriend's dogs on some trails near the beach. His dogs are both mixed breeds. One is a husky chow and the other is a pit bull. They're both affectionate, social, and easygoing. The trail we were on leads down to an estuary and starts in a state park. Since there are only 2 parking spots at the trailhead, it's almost always empty. The main trail is well maintained and leads to the estuary, but there's also an unofficial, overgrown trail that loops off from it. While it's hard to spot, I can tell others use it occasionally. On this day, we were on the main trail, approaching the estuary where we usually stop to watch birds. As we arrived, the husky began to growl low and puffed up, its fur standing on end. Living in an area with bears and cougars, I immediately thought of the potential danger. I drew my pistol and started backing up, trying to keep calm. Just then, a man emerged from behind a tree. He looked like a typical outdoorsy type, perhaps in his late 40s or early 50s, and dressed like he frequented craft breweries in Washington. The tree he hid behind wasn't very large, so he must have deliberately positioned himself there. As he walked toward me, he smiled and tried to soothe the growling husky, as if it were just a friendly dog. The dog continued to bark and growl in a way that was both unfamiliar and frightening. At that moment, my pit bull finally noticed the situation. She stepped between the man and me, her tail held at an odd angle and her teeth bared. Whether it was her menacing stance or the sight of my gun, the man's friendly demeanor changed abruptly. He gave me a look of pure malice, making my skin crawl. He stopped moving and didn't say anything further. I told him not to come any closer and quickly left, making sure he saw my weapon as I turned around. Once I reached the part of the trail that loops back, I took it to avoid the man. The dogs were on high alert, and I slowed down to listen and catch my breath, as I was exhausted. The loop trail is longer and more winding than the main path. As I neared the point where the loop reconnects with the main trail, the husky began to growl softly again. Thankfully, the man didn't hear it, as he was heading back toward the estuary. As soon as he was out of sight, we rushed the last stretch to the trailhead. My Subaru was parked there with the hatch open, which it hadn't been when I arrived. I tried to see the license plate but couldn't, and I didn't want to risk pausing to investigate. I quickly loaded my pit bull into the back of my Jeep and jumped in, taking off. Just as I turned onto the road, my pit bull barked, her first and only bark in the 6 months I'd known her. I suspect the man must have followed me from the trailhead, not knowing about the other path. He probably reached the trailhead before me, saw my Jeep, and opened the hatch for unknown reasons. When he heard my car door close, he likely raced back to the trailhead. My pit bull's bark seemed to communicate exactly how she felt about him. Since it was the off-season, the state park had minimal ranger presence. Once I was back on the road with cell signal, I called my brother, who is a cop in the town bordering the park. Though he wasn't on duty, it took a while for anyone to respond. I hope I never encounter that creepy guy in the woods again. Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed tonight's spine-chilling camping tales. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to bring you more heart-pounding horror stories soon. Stay safe, stay curious, and until next time, keep the campfire burning. Like and share this video and don't forget to subscribe the channel.